The funeral director's face went pale as he counted the people claiming to be Richard Bennett's children. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. His eyes darted to me, standing frozen in my black dress near the casket, and I watched confusion ripple across his features. 8 children total. My father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike in our quiet Portland driveway, who'd never missed a single one of my piano recitals, had apparently been teaching 7 other people to call him Dad. The woman standing closest to the casket, probably in her late 30s with my father's distinctive green eyes, placed her hand on the polished wood and whispered, "Goodbye, Daddy," and something inside me shattered so completely I thought everyone in that chapel must have heard it break. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, I'd been sitting in my apartment in the Pearl District, reviewing architectural plans for a client's kitchen renovation, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to Victor Morrison, a funeral director whose measured tone immediately told me something terrible had happened. "Your father, Richard Bennett, passed away this morning from a massive heart attack. I'm so sorry for your loss." The words didn't register at first. My father was 58, healthy as far as I knew, still running his carpentry business out of the workshop behind his Laurelhurst home. I'd seen him just 4 days ago for our usual Sunday brunch at the cafe on Hawthorne. The phone slipped slightly in my suddenly sweaty palm as Victor continued talking about arrangements, about how my father had apparently updated his funeral plans just 6 months ago, about how the service was scheduled for Thursday at Riverside Memorial Chapel. I managed to respond with appropriate words, though later I couldn't remember what I'd actually said. After hanging up, I sat motionless at my drafting table, staring at the kitchen layout in front of me as if the clean lines and precise measurements could somehow make sense of a world that had just tilted sideways. My mother, Patricia, had divorced my father when I was 12, moving to San Francisco for a job opportunity that I later understood was really an escape from a marriage that had quietly suffocated her. She'd never spoken badly about him, which I'd always appreciated, maintaining a civil relationship for my sake. When I called to tell her about his death, her response was oddly muted. "I'm sorry, Laura. I know you loved him very much." There was something in her voice, a careful quality that I registered but didn't examine, too caught up in my own grief to parse the subtleties of hers. The next 2 days passed in a fog of necessary tasks. I contacted my father's business partner, canceled his upcoming appointments, made decisions about flowers and music that felt simultaneously crucial and completely meaningless. My best friend Grace came over both evenings, bringing food I couldn't eat and sitting with me through long silences. She'd known my father well, had spent countless afternoons at our house during high school, and her grief felt like a strange mirror of my own. Thursday morning arrived with Portland's typical October drizzle, the kind of persistent mist that seems to seep into everything. I dressed carefully in the black sheath dress I'd worn to my grandmother's funeral 3 years earlier, applied minimal makeup that I knew would run anyway, and drove through familiar streets that suddenly felt alien. Everything looked exactly the same, coffee shops and boutiques and pedestrians hurrying under umbrellas, while my entire world had fundamentally changed. How could the city just continue like this, I remember thinking, when my father no longer existed in it. Riverside Memorial Chapel sat near the Willamette River, a tasteful building with large windows overlooking the water. I arrived early, wanting time alone with my father before other mourners appeared. Victor Morrison greeted me at the entrance, his professional sympathy well practiced but not unkind. The casket was already open in the main viewing room, surrounded by flower arrangements that filled the air with a cloying sweetness that made my stomach turn. I approached slowly, my heels clicking on the polished floor, and looked down at my father's face for the first time since he died. The funeral home had done their work well. He looked peaceful, younger somehow without the animation that had always characterized his features. I reached out to touch his hand, finding it cool and waxy, nothing like the warm grip that had held mine through childhood skinned knees and teenage heartbreaks and adult anxieties. This is real, I told myself, forcing the truth past the denial that kept insisting he'd wake up, that this was some elaborate mistake. I don't know how long I stood there, tears running silently down my face, whispering things I wished I'd said when he could hear them. The sound of the chapel door opening barely registered until Victor's voice, pitched with an uncertainty I hadn't heard before, cut through my grief. "Miss Bennett, there's someone here who says they're also family." I turned, expecting perhaps a distant cousin I'd forgotten about, and found myself facing a tall man in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair and a jawline that looked disturbingly familiar. "I'm Derek," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Derek Hayes. Richard was my father too." The words hung in the air between us, making no sense. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for him to explain that he meant stepfather or father figure or anything other than what he'd actually said. But his green eyes, the exact shade as my father's, as my own, held steady on my face with a grief that mirrored what I was feeling. "You must be confused," I finally managed. "My father didn't have other children. I'm his only daughter." Derek's expression shifted to something that looked like pity mixed with his own pain. "I'm sorry you're finding out this way. I thought you knew." He pulled out his wallet, extracting a worn photograph that he held out to me with a trembling hand. "This is me and Richard when I was 16. He took me fishing that summer at Bend." I took the photo automatically, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. My father, looking perhaps 40, stood with his arm around a teenage boy who had his same crooked smile, his same way of standing with his weight slightly on one foot. The image was old, the colors slightly faded, but undeniably real. Before I could formulate a response, the chapel door opened again. A woman around Derek's age entered, followed closely by a younger man, then another woman, then more people, a stream of strangers who all wore expressions of grief and all had something indefinable but unmistakable in their features that echoed the man in the casket. Victor Morrison looked increasingly distressed as each newcomer approached, offering condolences and introducing themselves with the same impossible claim. "I'm Vanessa, Richard's daughter. I'm Kyle, his son. I'm Tasha. I'm Brandon. I'm Simone. I'm Tyler." Each name fell like a stone into water, ripples spreading outward, distorting everything I thought I knew. The viewing room suddenly felt suffocatingly small. 7 people, ranging in age from early 20s to mid-40s, all claiming my father as their own. I looked wildly from face to face, searching for signs of a cruel joke or mass delusion, but finding only genuine sorrow and, in some cases, confusion that seemed to match my own. "Some of you didn't know about each other either," I heard myself say, the observation distant and clinical, as if I were narrating someone else's nightmare. Derek shook his head slowly. "I knew about Vanessa and Kyle. We have the same mother. But the others," he gestured vaguely at the younger siblings, "this is news to me too." A woman I vaguely recognized as having signed the guest book stepped forward. She was older, maybe in her early 60s, with tired eyes and a mouth set in a hard line. "I'm Diane Hayes," she said quietly. "Derek and Vanessa's mother. Richard and I were married for 8 years before Laura's mother came into the picture." The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. Married. My parents' marriage, which I'd thought was his first, had apparently been preceded by another entire family. The math was dizzying. If Derek was in his early 40s, and I was 29, that meant my father had been with my mother while he was still married to Diane, or at least very shortly after. "I think I need to sit down," I whispered, and suddenly Grace was there, materializing at my elbow though I hadn't even seen her arrive, guiding me to one of the cushioned chairs along the wall. The funeral proceeded in a surreal haze. Victor Morrison, clearly out of his depth but maintaining professional composure, arranged us into some semblance of order for the service. I sat in the front row, traditionally reserved for immediate family, flanked by 7 people whose existence rewrote my entire childhood. The minister, who'd met with me 2 days ago to discuss my father's life, stumbled slightly over his prepared remarks when he realized the family he'd heard about was dramatically incomplete. Behind us, the chapel filled with others who'd known Richard Bennett. Business associates from his carpentry company, clients whose homes he'd worked on, neighbors from Laurelhurst, members of the woodworking guild he belonged to. I caught fragments of whispered conversations, people clearly confused by the number of grieving children at the front, and shame burned through my chest alongside the grief. My father's secret life was being exposed in the most public way possible. The woman named Vanessa sat directly to my right. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. She had our father's high cheekbones, his expressive eyebrows, even his habit of biting her lower lip when distressed. At one point during the minister's eulogy, her hand moved slightly on the armrest between us, a gesture that might have been reaching for comfort or might have been accidental. I kept my own hands locked together in my lap, unable to bridge the space between us. After the service, as people filed past the casket for final goodbyes, I stood mechanically in the receiving line, shaking hands and accepting condolences while my mind spun with questions. How had he managed this? How had none of us known? Had my entire childhood been a lie, every moment he was present just borrowed time from these other families he'd been maintaining? A man I recognized as Howard Walsh, my father's lawyer, approached with a grim expression. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you and the others about your father's estate. Can you all come to my office tomorrow at 10? The others. The phrase landed like a physical blow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wasn't the sole inheritor anymore, wasn't even the primary family member. I was one of 8, a fraction of something I'd thought was whole. That evening, after declining invitations from both Derek and Grace to not be alone, I drove to my father's house. I still had a key, had been letting myself in for Sunday brunches for years. The craftsman home stood dark and empty, rain dripping from the eaves, the workshop out back silent for the first time I could remember. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter with a ring of dried residue at the bottom. The newspaper from Tuesday lay on the breakfast table, half-completed crossword puzzle abandoned mid-word. His reading glasses rested on the arm of his favorite chair in the living room, still holding the indent where he'd last placed them. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching surfaces, opening drawers, searching for evidence of the massive deception he'd maintained. In his bedroom, the closet held only his clothes, no women's items to suggest he'd been living with anyone. The bathroom was similarly solitary. If he'd had these other families, he'd kept them completely separate from this space. The workshop drew me finally, that familiar space where I'd spent countless hours watching him work, learning to sand wood properly, to measure twice and cut once, all his patient lessons delivered in that calm voice I'd never hear again. I flipped on the overhead lights, illuminating workbenches covered with current projects, tools hung in precise rows, sawdust still scattered across the concrete floor. A filing cabinet in the corner caught my attention. I'd never looked through it before, assuming it held boring business documents. Now I approached it with a sense of dread and desperate need to understand. The drawers weren't locked. Inside, I found folders neatly labeled with names. Derek Hayes. Vanessa Torres. Kyle Morrison. Tasha Williams. Brandon Cruz. Simone Parker. Tyler Chen. Laura Bennett. My folder was thinner than some of the others. Inside were copies of my report cards, programs from piano recitals, newspaper clippings about a design award I'd won last year, photographs from throughout my life. Evidence that he'd tracked my existence, documented my achievements. But the other folders contained similar items. Derek's high school diploma copy. Vanessa's wedding announcement. Kyle's military service records. Each child carefully catalogued, our lives running in parallel without ever intersecting. At the bottom of the drawer was a leather journal, its cover worn soft with handling. I pulled it out with shaking hands and opened to the first page. Property of Richard Bennett, Personal Reflections, written in my father's distinctive blocky handwriting. I sank onto his work stool and began to read. The entry started 23 years ago, shortly after my parents' divorce. The guilt is consuming me, the first entry read. Diane deserves better. Patricia deserves better. All of them deserve a father who isn't fractured into pieces, trying to be everywhere and present nowhere. Page after page revealed a man tormented by choices he'd made, unable to extricate himself from the complicated web he'd woven. He'd married Diane young, had Derek and Vanessa quickly. Then he'd met my mother at a carpentry job, fallen into an affair that resulted in my conception. My mother had insisted he leave his family or she'd raise me alone. He'd chosen her, divorced Diane, but never really left. He continued seeing his first 2 children secretly, maintaining a relationship Diane had eventually accepted out of love for her kids. But then there were others. Kyle, born to a woman named Jennifer Morrison who he'd met at a woodworking convention. Tasha, whose mother worked at the hardware store he frequented. Brandon, Simone, Tyler, each from different relationships, different moments of weakness or genuine connection. I couldn't tell which from his anguished writing. I should stop, he wrote in one entry from 15 years ago. I should choose one family and let the others go. But how do you abandon your own children? How do you look at a son or daughter and say you're not important enough? So I split myself thinner, give each of them pieces, and pray none of them ever realizes they don't have the whole father they deserve. The journal fell from my numb fingers. My father hadn't been a cruel man or a calculating deceiver. He'd been weak, unable to make hard choices, trying to be everything to everyone and succeeding only in creating 8 separate partial families. The tragedy of it pressed down on me with crushing weight. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. Are you okay? Do you need me to come over? I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. I'm at Dad's house. Found some things. I don't know what to do with any of this. Her response was immediate. Coming now. Don't move. While I waited for her, I opened the other folders, looking at the strangers who were apparently my siblings. Derek's folder was thick, chronicling a life I knew nothing about. High school baseball star, married at 22, divorced at 30, remarried at 35. 2 children of his own, which meant I was an aunt without knowing it. Vanessa had 3 kids. Kyle had been in the Marines. Each folder was a complete life running parallel to mine, never touching, existing in separate universes my father had somehow managed to keep from colliding. Until now. Until death had brought us all together in that chapel, forcing us to acknowledge what he'd never had the courage to reveal. Grace arrived 20 minutes later, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago. She found me still in the workshop, surrounded by the evidence of my father's double life, my face streaked with tears I didn't remember shedding. Oh, Laura, she breathed, taking in the scattered folders and open journal. She pulled me into a fierce hug that finally broke through the shock, and I sobbed against her shoulder with a grief that was no longer just about death but about betrayal, about discovering that the foundation I'd built my life on had always been an illusion. When I could speak again, I showed her everything. The folders, the journal, the careful documentation of 8 separate children. Grace read silently, her expression growing more horrified with each page. What are you going to do? She finally asked. I don't know, I admitted. There's a meeting tomorrow at the lawyer's office. About the estate. I guess I'll learn then just how divided everything really is. That's not what I meant, Grace said gently. I meant what are you going to do about them? Your siblings. The word felt foreign on my tongue. Siblings. I'd been an only child my entire life, had internalized that identity completely. The idea of suddenly having 7 brothers and sisters was incomprehensible. They're strangers, I said flatly. The fact that we share DNA doesn't make us family. Grace studied me with the expression that meant she disagreed but wouldn't push. Maybe not yet. But you're all dealing with the same thing. Maybe that's enough to start with. I couldn't imagine it. Couldn't picture building relationships with these people who represented everything broken about my father's character, everything false about the life I'd thought we'd shared. The anger was building now, pushing past the shock, hot and bitter in my throat. He lied to all of us, I said, my voice hardening. Every single day of my life was built on lies. Every time he said he loved me, every Sunday brunch, every phone call, it was all while he was doing the same thing with 7 other people. How do I forgive that? Grace didn't have an answer. We sat in the workshop's harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by the ghost of a man who'd tried to be everywhere and ended up leaving wreckage behind him when he disappeared. The next morning, I arrived at Howard Walsh's office in downtown Portland feeling hollowed out and brittle. The building was one of those renovated warehouses in the Pearl, all exposed brick and modern fixtures. The waiting area already held most of my supposed siblings. Derek stood near the window, staring out at the city. Vanessa sat in one of the leather chairs, scrolling through her phone with tense shoulders. Kyle, the one who'd been in the military, stood with parade rest posture near the receptionist's desk. The younger ones clustered together on a sofa, their family resemblance even more apparent when they sat side by side. None of them looked at me when I entered. The awkwardness was suffocating. Howard's assistant ushered us into a large conference room with a table that barely fit all of us. Howard himself was a silver-haired man in his 60s who'd apparently known my father for 20 years. His expression was carefully neutral as he arranged papers in front of him. "Thank you all for coming," he began once we were settled. "I know this is an incredibly difficult time, made more complicated by circumstances that have come to light. Your father updated his will 6 months ago, and I believe he intended to have conversations with all of you before," he paused delicately, "before this situation arose naturally." "So he knew he was going to tell us," Vanessa said, her voice sharp. "He just ran out of time." Howard nodded slowly. "He expressed to me that he wanted to bring you all together, to explain everything properly. He was planning a gathering for Thanksgiving, actually. He'd asked me to prepare documents for that meeting." The cruelty of it struck me freshly. My father had been 6 weeks away from revealing his secret, from finally acknowledging all of us in front of each other. 6 weeks from potentially starting whatever healing process might have been possible. Instead, his heart had given out, leaving us to piece together the truth from paper trails and shocked discoveries. "The estate is substantial," Howard continued, pulling us back to the immediate reality. "The house in Laurelhurst, the carpentry business, investment accounts, life insurance. After all debts and taxes, the total value is approximately $1.2 million. A number that would have seemed enormous 3 days ago now felt paltry, divided 8 ways. $50,000 each. Not nothing, but not the security I'd vaguely imagined would come from being my father's heir." "Your father's instructions were explicit," Howard said, looking around the table at each of us. "The estate is to be divided equally among all his children, with one provision." "Here it comes," Derek muttered. "There's always a catch." Howard's expression grew sympathetic. "He wanted you to spend time together. Before any inheritance is distributed, you must all attend a weekend retreat at the family cabin in Bend. Together. All 8 of you." The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at the lawyer in disbelief. A forced family bonding weekend with 7 strangers who shared my father's betrayal? It was absurd, manipulative, exactly the kind of avoidance my father had apparently specialized in. Fix it after death, make us play happy family when he'd never had the courage to bring us together while alive. "And if we refuse?" Kyle asked, his military bearing evident in the clipped question. Howard's face was apologetic. "Then the entire estate goes to charity. The Oregon Woodworkers Foundation, specifically." "So we don't have a choice," Brandon, one of the younger ones, said bitterly. "We play along or we get nothing." "You have a choice," Howard corrected gently. "It's just a choice with consequences." I looked around the table at these strangers who wore my father's features in different configurations. Derek's jaw, Vanessa's eyes, Kyle's hands that were exact copies of the ones I saw in my own mirror every day. We were all pieces of the same broken whole, fragments of a man who'd never figured out how to be complete for any of us. When would this retreat need to happen? I heard myself ask, my voice sounding distant and resigned. Howard looked relieved that someone was engaging practically with the requirement. "The cabin is available starting next weekend. I'd suggest 3 days, Friday through Sunday. That gives you all time to make arrangements." One of the younger women, Simone I thought, laughed without humor. 3 days to become a family. That seems totally reasonable. But no one voiced an outright refusal. The money wasn't life-changing, but it was significant enough that walking away felt impossible. My father, even in death, was still manipulating us into the shape he'd wanted, the united family he'd never managed to create while breathing. The meeting concluded with logistics and paperwork. Howard provided directions to the cabin, explained that it was fully stocked and winterized, assured us that groceries would be delivered. Everything arranged, everything controlled, our father's invisible hand still directing our movements. As we filed out of the office, Derek caught up with me in the hallway. "Laura, wait." I turned reluctantly, not sure what to say to this man who was somehow my brother. "I know this is awful," he said, his face reflecting genuine distress. "Finding out this way, all of us together at the funeral. But maybe we should exchange numbers? Before the retreat?" "Why?" The word came out harsher than I intended. Derek flinched slightly. "Because we're in the same boat? Because none of us asked for this but we're all stuck with it? Because maybe understanding each other makes it slightly less terrible?" His logic was sound, but I couldn't make myself care. I pulled out my phone mechanically and we exchanged contact information, a perfunctory gesture that felt meaningless. The others were doing the same behind us, creating a group chat that I immediately muted after Derek added me. Grace picked me up outside the building. I'd asked her to come, needing a buffer between the meeting and returning to my empty apartment. She took one look at my face and didn't ask questions, just drove us to a quiet cafe on Hawthorne where we sat with coffee neither of us drank. "A weekend retreat," I finally said. "All of us together at some cabin I didn't even know existed. It's like a sick joke." "Maybe it'll help," Grace offered hesitantly. "Getting to know them, I mean. They're going through the same thing you are." I shook my head. "They're not going through the same thing. They had years of knowing Dad was complicated, of understanding he had other families. I thought he was just mine." Grace reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry, Laura. This is unfair in every possible way." The tears came again, quieter this time, just leaking from the corners of my eyes. "I loved him so much, Grace. How do I reconcile that with what he did? How do I look at my entire childhood and not see lies?" "Maybe you don't have to reconcile it yet," she said softly. "Maybe you just survive it first." Surviving. That felt like the only achievable goal. Get through the next hour, the next day, the next weekend in a cabin with strangers who shared my blood and my grief and my father's incredible capacity for compartmentalization. The week until the retreat crawled by with agonizing slowness. I tried to work, to focus on my clients' renovation projects, but found myself staring at blueprints without seeing them. My apartment felt simultaneously too empty and too confining. I avoided my mother's calls, not ready to hear whatever explanation or apology she might offer for her own role in the deception. The group chat I'd muted kept accumulating unread messages. Finally, 2 days before we were supposed to leave, I forced myself to open it. Most of the messages were logistical, working out carpooling and arrival times. But scattered among the practical planning were glimpses of the people behind the names. Vanessa asking if anyone had food allergies. Tasha sharing that she was nervous about the whole thing. Brandon making a dark joke about family dysfunction that earned a laughing emoji from Simone. They were trying, I realized. Trying to make something livable out of this disaster. And I was hiding, refusing to engage, protecting myself by keeping distance. But distance had been my father's strategy, and look where that had gotten him. 8 children who barely knew each other, a lifetime of fragmented relationships, and a death that brought together strangers instead of family. Friday morning arrived with clear October skies, unusual for Portland. I packed a bag mechanically, threw it in my car, and pointed toward Bend. The drive was just over 3 hours, winding through increasingly rural landscapes as the city fell away behind me. I'd made this drive before, visiting Bend's breweries and hiking trails with friends, never knowing that somewhere in these mountains sat a cabin where my father had apparently brought his other children. The address Howard had provided led me down a series of increasingly narrow roads until I pulled up in front of a rustic log cabin nestled among ponderosa pines. 2 other cars were already parked outside. I sat behind my wheel for a long moment, gathering courage, before finally forcing myself out into the crisp mountain air. The cabin door opened before I reached it. Derek stood in the doorway, looking as uncomfortable as I felt. "Hey," he said quietly. "You made it okay?" I nodded, unable to summon more than that single gesture. He stepped aside to let me enter, and I found myself in a large open living space with exposed beams and a river rock fireplace. Vanessa and Kyle were unpacking groceries in the attached kitchen. The younger siblings hadn't arrived yet. "We put you in the room upstairs on the left," Derek said, gesturing to a loft area. "Hope that's okay." "It's fine," I managed, grabbing my bag and escaping to the designated space before anyone could attempt actual conversation. The room was simple but comfortable, with a queen bed covered in a handmade quilt and windows overlooking the forest. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muted sounds of my supposed siblings moving around downstairs, and wondered how I was possibly going to survive 3 days of this. This was my new reality. Not an only child anymore but one of 8, not my father's special daughter but just another fragment of his divided attention. The life I'd known had ended in that funeral chapel, replaced by something I didn't recognize and hadn't chosen. Grace's words echoed in my mind. "Maybe you just survive it first." So that's what I would do. Survive this weekend, take the inheritance money, and then go back to my real life, free from any obligation to these strangers who shared nothing with me but DNA and a dead man's secrets. I had no idea then how wrong I was about what shared grief and forced proximity could create, how much my definition of family was about to be challenged and rebuilt into something I'd never imagined possible. But that discovery still lay ahead. For now, I just sat in that cabin room, listening to my unknown siblings' voices drift up from below, and tried to convince myself that survival was enough. The sound of car doors slamming pulled me from my thoughts. Through the window, I watched the remaining siblings arrive together, apparently having carpooled from Seattle. Tasha emerged first, a petite woman with dark skin and our father's distinctive laugh that I could hear even through the glass. Brandon followed, tall and lanky with nervous energy evident in how he kept adjusting his backpack. Simone came next, moving with a dancer's grace, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Tyler was last, the youngest at 22, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets and his expression closed off in a way I recognized from my own mirror that morning. I stayed in my room longer than necessary, unpacking my bag with deliberate slowness, refolding clothes that didn't need attention, anything to delay the inevitable moment of group interaction. But eventually the sounds of dinner preparation drifted up the stairs, along with the rich aroma of something Italian cooking, and my stomach reminded me I'd barely eaten in days. The descent down the wooden stairs felt like walking to an execution. All 7 of them were in the kitchen and adjoining living area when I appeared, and conversation stuttered to an awkward halt. Vanessa stood at the stove stirring a large pot of pasta sauce, her movements practiced and confident. Derek was setting the long dining table with mismatched plates he'd apparently found in the cabin's cupboards. The others clustered around the kitchen island, nursing beers and looking anywhere but at each other. "Laura," Vanessa said, her voice carefully neutral. "There's plenty of food. I hope you like marinara." I wasn't sure what everyone's preferences were, so I went simple. "It smells good," I managed, the words feeling inadequate but at least polite. "Can I help with anything?" Kyle gestured to the refrigerator. "Grab a drink if you want. Beer, wine, some sparkling water." Dad apparently kept this place well stocked. The casual way he said Dad made something twist in my chest. That word, which had belonged to my father and me, was now communal property, shared among 8 people who all had equal claim to it. I pulled out a bottle of wine without looking at the label and poured myself a generous glass. Dinner was served with minimal conversation, everyone focused intently on their plates as if the pasta required complete concentration. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Tasha, sitting across from me, cleared her throat. "So this is weird, right?" She looked around the table, her expression almost defiant. "Can we at least acknowledge that this is completely surreal?" Brandon let out a sharp laugh. "Understatement of the century. A week ago I didn't know any of you existed. Now we're having family dinner." "Some of us knew," Derek said quietly. "About some of the others, anyway." Mom told me about Vanessa when I was 15. Said I had a sister Dad was still seeing. Vanessa nodded. I found out about Derek around the same time. But the rest of you, she gestured vaguely at the younger siblings and me, I had no idea until the funeral. Kyle set down his fork with deliberate precision. I knew about none of you. My mom told me my father was dead, that he'd died before I was born. Then 6 months ago, I get a letter from Richard Bennett asking to meet me. Turns out my mother had lied for 30 years because she was angry he wouldn't leave his wife for her. Which wife? Simone asked, her voice edged with bitterness. Seems like he collected them. He wasn't married to all our mothers, Derek said defensively. Just to mine and Laura's. And mine, Tyler spoke up for the first time, his voice quiet. My mom was his third wife. They were married for 2 years before she found out about the rest of you and filed for divorce. I was one when that happened. The revelations kept coming, each one adding another layer to the impossibly complicated web our father had woven. I listened in stunned silence as my siblings, these strangers I was tied to by blood and betrayal, pieced together a timeline that spanned 4 decades. Our father had been 20 when Derek was born, barely more than a kid himself. He'd been 56 when Tyler entered the world, still unable or unwilling to untangle the mess he'd created. Did any of your mothers know about all of us? I finally asked, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. The question hung there, unanswered, until Vanessa spoke. I don't think so. I think he kept us all separate, told each mother there were maybe 1 or 2 others but never the full truth. That way nobody could force him to choose or demand he cut contact completely. Strategic compartmentalization, Kyle said grimly. Classic behavior for someone living multiple lives. He must have had a hell of a system to keep it all straight. Brandon pulled out his phone and opened the group chat Howard had created for us. He put us all in here, right? Let's see how far apart we all are. He started listing addresses as people provided them. Derek in Tacoma, Vanessa in Seattle suburbs, Kyle in Portland but on the east side, Tasha in Gresham, me in Vancouver, Simone in Beaverton, Tyler still in Seattle. And me in Pearl District, I added reluctantly. All within a 2-hour radius. He could visit any of us on any given day. Probably did, Derek muttered. I remember him having a lot of work trips. Carpentry consultations, he'd say. Emergency jobs. Now I'm wondering how many of those were actually visits to the rest of you. The calculation was staggering. Our father must have operated on a carefully maintained schedule, rotating through his children like appointments on a calendar. Sunday brunches with me. Tuesday dinners with Derek and Vanessa. Weekends with Kyle. Birthdays carefully staggered so he could attend each one. My head spun trying to imagine the mental gymnastics required to sustain that level of deception for decades. After dinner, we migrated to the living room with fresh drinks, the discomfort easing slightly as wine and beer softened the sharp edges of our situation. Derek built a fire in the River Rock fireplace, and the crackling flames created an intimacy that felt both welcome and threatening. So what do we actually do here? Simone asked, curled into one corner of a worn leather sofa. Howard said we had to spend the weekend together, but he didn't specify activities. Do we just sit around being awkward for 3 days? We could try to get to know each other, Vanessa suggested. I mean, we're siblings. That means something, doesn't it? Does it though? The words escaped before I could stop them, sharper than I'd intended. All 7 heads turned toward me. We share DNA. That's biology, not relationship. You can't manufacture family out of a dead man's guilt trip. Derek's expression tightened. Is that what you think this is? A guilt trip? Isn't it? I challenged, the wine and exhaustion lowering my filter. He couldn't face us while he was alive, couldn't bring himself to tell the truth, so now he's forcing us together from beyond the grave to do the emotional work he was too cowardly to handle himself. The silence that followed was thick with tension. I expected anger, expected them to defend the father we'd all lost, but instead I saw uncomfortable recognition on several faces. She's not wrong, Tasha said softly. This is manipulation. A nice manipulation, maybe, trying to give us something he couldn't create himself, but still manipulation. Kyle leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Here's what I know. I spent 30 years thinking my father was dead. Then he came back into my life for exactly 6 months before actually dying. 6 months of Sunday coffees and awkward phone calls and trying to build something from nothing. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. I was angry when he died. Angry that he'd wasted so much time, angry that we'd barely started when it ended. But at least I got those 6 months. At least he tried. He turned back to face us. So yeah, maybe this weekend is manipulation. Maybe it's him trying to fix from death what he broke in life. But we're here. All of us. And we can either spend 3 days being bitter about what he did wrong, or we can try to find something salvageable in what's left. His words settled over the room like snow, muffling the sharp edges of resentment. I wanted to argue, to insist that nothing good could come from this forced proximity, but something in Kyle's intensity stopped me. What did you want to know? Derek asked, directing the question at me. When you found out about us, what was the first thing you wondered? I considered lying, deflecting, but exhaustion made honesty easier. Whether he loved me less because he had to divide his attention 7 other ways. Derek's expression softened. I wondered the same thing. Every time he canceled plans or cut a visit short, I wondered if it was because one of his other kids needed him more. He never canceled on me, I admitted, the guilt of that privilege sitting heavy in my chest. Not once in 29 years. Lucky you, Tyler said, but without real venom. He missed my high school graduation. Said he had a work emergency. I bet he was at one of yours. The implication hung there, toxic and true. My graduation, my recitals, my achievements had all been prioritized, possibly at the expense of these siblings I'd never known existed. The special treatment I'd basked in suddenly felt tainted. He came to my Marine Corps graduation, Kyle offered. Told me he wouldn't miss it for the world. I remember feeling so proud that he'd traveled all the way to San Diego. Vanessa smiled sadly. He walked me down the aisle at my wedding. Cried during the father-daughter dance. We began trading memories then, hesitant at first but gaining momentum. Each story revealed a different facet of the man we'd all called Dad. Derek described a father who taught him carpentry with patient precision. Vanessa remembered elaborate birthday celebrations where he'd built custom furniture for her dollhouse. Tasha spoke of nature hikes where he'd identified every tree and bird. Brandon recalled fishing trips where conversation flowed easy and genuine. With each memory shared, a more complete picture emerged. Our father had been flawed, desperately so, but he'd also genuinely loved each of us in his fractured way. He hadn't been faking the affection or going through motions. He'd simply been incapable of integrating his loves into a coherent whole, so he'd kept them separate, dooming himself to a life of constant division. He taught me to drive, Simone said, her voice thick with emotion. Took me to an empty parking lot every Sunday for 2 months until I got my license. He was so patient, never got mad even when I hit that curb and popped the tire. Same, I heard myself say. He took me to the parking lot behind the community college. Made me practice parallel parking until I could do it perfectly. Our eyes met across the room, a moment of genuine connection in the shared experience. We'd learned to drive in the same way, possibly in the same locations, our father repeating the same lessons with the same patience for daughters who'd never met. The fire burned low as midnight approached. Someone, I think Brandon, suggested we should probably sleep, that tomorrow would be easier with rest. But nobody moved. We stayed in that living room, circling closer to something that might eventually resemble understanding if not quite forgiveness. I thought about my mother then, about her muted response to the news of my father's death. Had she known? Had she suspected the full scope of his deception? Our divorce had been civilized, almost friendly, which now seemed suspicious. Most ex-wives wouldn't maintain such cordiality unless they'd achieved some kind of closure or understanding. Did your mothers ever meet him? I asked suddenly. After he and your mom split, did he stay in their lives at all? He came to family events sometimes, Derek said. Mom's second wedding, major birthdays. They were friendly. I always thought that was weird, how okay she seemed with everything. Mine hated him, Tyler said flatly. She moved us to Seattle partly to get away from him. But she still let him visit me, never tried to completely cut him out. Mine didn't know he existed until I was 18, Tasha added. He'd paid child support through lawyers, never had direct contact. When I finally met him, she was furious. Accused him of abandoning us. He just took it, apologized, said she was right but asked if I'd give him a chance anyway. The variety of mother responses painted another layer onto the complicated portrait. Some had known and accepted. Some had known and seethed. Some had been kept deliberately in the dark, receiving checks and lies in equal measure. I need to ask my mom questions, I said, pulling out my phone and staring at her contact. She's been calling all week and I've been avoiding her. But she must have known something. Vanessa nodded. Mine too. I think they all knew more than they told us. Protecting us maybe, or protecting themselves. Or protecting him, Kyle said grimly. Making it easier for him to maintain his separate worlds by not forcing confrontation. The conversation wound down naturally as exhaustion finally caught up with wine and emotional overload. We dispersed to our assigned rooms, calling quiet goodnights that felt surreal in their domesticity. I climbed the stairs to my loft space and closed the door, leaning against it with eyes closed. My phone showed 3 missed calls from my mother and a text. Please call me, honey. I know you must have questions. I'm ready to answer them now. I almost called right then, but something stopped me. Tomorrow, I decided. Tonight I'd already processed enough revelations. Tomorrow I'd face whatever truths my mother had been keeping. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by sounds of my siblings moving through the cabin. Footsteps on stairs, water running in bathrooms, voices murmuring too low to make out words. I wondered if they were sleeping any better than I was, if they were lying awake processing the same impossible reality. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through pine trees and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. I dressed in comfortable clothes, jeans and a sweater, and descended to find Derek already at the stove making pancakes while Vanessa set out fruit and yogurt. Couldn't sleep, Derek said without preamble when he noticed me. Figured I might as well make myself useful. I poured coffee from the pot, wrapping both hands around the warm mug. Same. My brain won't shut off. Other siblings trickled in gradually, drawn by the smell of food and the promise of caffeine. We ate breakfast in comparative quiet, everyone still processing the previous night's emotional excavation. Kyle broke the silence. I think we should go through Dad's things. Here at the cabin, I mean. Howard said he used to come here alone sometimes. There might be more journals or letters or something that helps us understand. Is it really understanding we need? Simone asked. Or just acceptance that he was complicated and will never fully know why he did what he did? Both, Vanessa said firmly. I want to understand. I need to believe there was a reason beyond selfishness or cowardice. So we searched. The cabin wasn't large, maybe 1,200 square feet counting the loft, but our father had left traces everywhere. A bookshelf in the living room held journals spanning 30 years, leather-bound volumes chronicling his internal struggle. A desk drawer contained letters he'd written but never sent to various children, apologies and explanations and promises to do better. I found a box in the closet of my assigned room, tucked behind extra blankets and labeled simply Laura. Inside were more photographs of me throughout childhood, but also drafts of letters my father had apparently tried to write multiple times. Dear Laura, I need to tell you something important. Dear Laura, you have brothers and sisters you don't know about. Dear Laura, I've made terrible mistakes. None of them finished, all of them abandoned mid-sentence as if he'd lost courage or hope or both. Vanessa discovered a similar box labeled with her name. Derek found his in the loft storage. Slowly we realized our father had created individual repositories for each child, private museums of his relationship with us that he'd never shown anyone. We gathered in the living room with our respective boxes, spreading contents across the floor like archaeologists examining artifacts of a lost civilization. The evidence of his love was undeniable: photographs and ticket stubs from events he'd attended, programs from school plays and sports games, handwritten notes chronicling milestones he'd witnessed. But alongside the love was the documentation of his deception. Calendar pages showing how he'd scheduled his time, color-coded by child. Expense ledgers tracking money spent on each family, meticulously balanced to ensure no one received significantly more or less than the others. Lists of lies he'd told to cover visits, work emergencies and family obligations, and last-minute changes that were actually trips to see other children. He loved us, Tasha said, holding a photo of herself at maybe 8 years old with our father at what looked like an amusement park. You can see it in how he's looking at me here. That's genuine affection. But he also lied to us constantly, Brandon countered. Every day of our lives was built on his deception. How do those things coexist? Derek set down a journal he'd been reading, his expression thoughtful. I think he was a fundamentally weak man who wanted to do right by everyone and didn't have the spine to make hard choices. So he tried to do everything, be everything, and ended up fractured. Is that enough? I asked, not sure myself what answer I wanted. Is understanding his weakness enough to forgive the damage it caused? Nobody answered because there wasn't an answer, not one that worked for everyone. We sat surrounded by the evidence of our father's dual nature, his capacity for both genuine love and elaborate deception, and tried to integrate those contradictions into something coherent. Kyle stood suddenly. I need air. Anyone want to walk? Several of us agreed, grateful for the excuse to move, to let the mountain environment provide distraction from the emotional intensity. We bundled into jackets and headed out into the crisp October morning. The cabin sat on several acres of forested land with trails winding through ponderosa pines and aspens just starting to turn gold. We walked in a loose group, conversation flowing more naturally in motion than it had sitting still. Tasha fell into step beside me. So you're an architect? Or interior designer? I saw something about design in one of the articles in your box. Interior designer, I confirmed. Mostly residential renovations. You? Elementary school teacher. 3rd grade. She smiled slightly. Dad used to come to my classroom sometimes, volunteer to help with the woodworking unit we did every spring. The image of my father surrounded by 8-year-olds, patient and encouraging, fit perfectly with the man I'd known. It also highlighted the tragedy of his choices. He could have been an amazing grandfather to all the nieces and nephews his children were starting to have, could have been the patriarch of a large, complicated but genuine family. Instead, he'd fragmented himself until death forced the convergence he'd been too afraid to create. We reached a clearing with a view of the Cascade Mountains, snow already dusting the higher peaks. The beauty was stark and unforgiving, much like the truth we were all grappling with. I called my mom this morning, Vanessa said to the group. Asked her point blank if she'd known about all of us. What did she say? Derek asked. Vanessa's expression was complicated. She said she'd suspected but never confirmed. Dad would mention having to help a friend or visit a cousin, and the excuses were just frequent enough to make her wonder. But she never pushed because part of her didn't want to know. She was raising 2 kids mostly alone already. Finding out there were 5 more would have just made it worse. So she chose comfortable ignorance, Kyle said. Can you blame her? Vanessa shot back. What would knowing have changed? He wasn't going to leave the other kids. She couldn't force him to choose. At least the ambiguity left room for hope. I thought about my own mother, about the careful way she'd maintained distance after the divorce while never actively alienating me from my father. Had she known? Had she suspected? My finger hovered over her contact again. Simone noticed. You should call her. You won't have peace until you do. She was right. I stepped away from the group slightly and dialed before I could lose my nerve. My mother answered on the second ring. Laura, honey. Her voice was warm and worried. How are you holding up? Did you know? The words came out without preamble. About the other children. Did you know Dad had 7 other kids? The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I had my answer before she spoke. I suspected there were others. Maybe 2 or 3. I didn't know the full extent until you called after the funeral. Why didn't you tell me? My voice cracked despite my efforts to keep it steady. Why let me grow up thinking I was an only child when you knew that probably wasn't true? My mother sighed, the sound heavy with old regrets. Because I didn't know for certain, and I didn't want to burden you with suspicions I couldn't prove. And because, she paused, because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I'd chosen a man who was capable of that, ashamed that I'd stayed with him as long as I did even after I started to suspect. When did you start suspecting? Maybe 3 years into our marriage. There were signs, if I let myself see them. Phone calls he'd take in another room. Weekends he had to work that didn't quite add up. A woman's earring I found in his car that he claimed belonged to a client. But I was pregnant with you by then, and I wanted to believe him. So I did. The truth settled over me like a weight. My mother had chosen willful blindness, and I'd been raised in the gap between suspicion and confirmation. Did you love him? I asked. Very much. And I think he loved me too, in his way. He just loved others as well, and he couldn't figure out how to do both honestly. She paused. Are you okay, honey? Really okay? I looked back at the group of siblings waiting for me, their faces turned toward the mountains with expressions of shared contemplation. I don't know yet. But I'm not alone in it, at least. After I hung up, I rejoined the others and shared what my mother had said. It sparked a round of similar admissions. Derek's mother had known about my mother but not the others. Kyle's mother had known about Derek and Vanessa but convinced herself they were the only ones. Tasha's mother had known nothing and felt betrayed decades later when the truth emerged. Our father had carefully calibrated each relationship, giving each woman just enough truth to feel trusted while withholding enough to maintain his separate worlds. It was manipulative and devastating and spoke to a level of sustained deception that seemed almost sociopathic. Yet the journals we'd read showed genuine anguish. He'd hated lying. He'd tortured himself over the harm he was causing. He just lacked whatever strength or courage was required to stop. We hiked back to the cabin in contemplative silence. The day was only half over, and we still had the rest of the weekend ahead of us. But something had shifted during the morning's revelations and outdoor processing. We were still strangers in many ways, still navigating the bizarre reality of sudden siblinghood, but the sharp edges of anger had dulled slightly. Back at the cabin, Vanessa suggested we make lunch together, and somehow that simple domestic task became the breakthrough moment. Working side by side in the kitchen, passing ingredients and utensils, falling into easy banter about cooking techniques and food preferences, we started to glimpse what family might look like if we let it. Tyler, the quietest of us all, actually laughed at one of Brandon's jokes. Simone and I discovered we had the same favorite restaurant in Portland, had probably been there on the same nights without knowing we were sitting near our sister. Derek shared photos of his kids, our nieces and nephews, and the resemblance to our shared grandfather was striking enough to make everyone crowd around his phone. These small connections, meaningless individually but accumulating into something substantial, began to weave threads between us. We weren't manufacturing closeness so much as discovering it had been there all along, dormant and waiting for the chance to develop. After lunch, someone suggested cards, and we spent the afternoon playing increasingly competitive games of hearts and spades. Trash talk emerged, alliances formed and dissolved, and laughter came more easily. For hours at a time, I forgot to be angry or hurt or confused. I was just present, engaged in the moment with these people who increasingly felt less like strangers. As dinner approached, Derek started a second fire and Kyle opened wine. We settled into the living room naturally, the seating arrangements less awkward than they'd been the previous evening. What happens after this weekend? Simone asked the question we'd all been avoiding. Do we just go back to our separate lives? Pretend this didn't happen? I don't want that, Vanessa said firmly. I want to know you all. I want my kids to know their aunts and uncles. I want Dad's grandchildren to grow up together even if we didn't. Agreed, Derek said. We could do monthly dinners or something. Rotate who hosts. The suggestions came faster then. A group text thread that wasn't muted. Holiday celebrations together. Maybe even a family vacation next summer if everyone could manage it. The plans were tentative and uncertain, but they represented possibility. I listened without committing, still not sure what I wanted from these relationships. But I didn't argue against the planning, didn't shut down the hope in their voices. That night, after another shared meal and more conversation that revealed our similarities and differences, I lay in bed feeling something I hadn't expected. Not happiness exactly, but maybe the beginning of acceptance. These people weren't replacements for the father we'd lost or compensation for the deception he'd practiced. They were just themselves, complicated and damaged and trying just like I was. And maybe that was enough to start with. Sunday morning arrived too quickly, bringing with it the awareness that our mandated time together was nearly complete. I woke to voices downstairs, quieter than the previous mornings, as if everyone was reluctant to disturb the fragile peace we'd constructed. When I descended, I found most of my siblings already gathered around the dining table with coffee and pastries someone had driven into town to collect. The conversation paused when I appeared, but not with the awkwardness of 2 days ago. Now it felt more like making space for me to join, an acknowledgement of my presence rather than discomfort with it. I poured coffee and settled into an empty chair between Tasha and Brandon, accepting a cinnamon roll from the bakery box being passed around. So we need to talk about what comes next, Kyle said, his military directness cutting through the morning lethargy. We fulfilled Howard's requirement. We spent the weekend together. But I think we all know that's not really the point. What is the point then? Tyler asked, his tone not challenging but genuinely curious. Derek set down his mug with careful precision. I think the point is figuring out if we want to be family or just people who share biology and a complicated inheritance. The distinction hung there, weighted with implications. Family meant obligations and expectations and vulnerability. Shared biology was safer, more distant, easier to walk away from when things got difficult. I vote family, Vanessa said quietly. I know that might sound naive given that we barely know each other, but I've spent 2 days with you all and I like who you are. Not just because Dad chose you but because of who you actually are as people. Simone nodded agreement. I came here expecting to hate this. Expecting to collect my inheritance check and never speak to any of you again. But she looked around the table, her expression vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. I don't want that anymore. My mom died 3 years ago. I don't have much family left. The idea of having siblings, actual siblings I could call when life gets hard, that matters. Brandon cleared his throat, his usual humor subdued. Same. My mom's side of the family basically disowned her when she had me out of wedlock. It's been just us two my whole life. Having this, he gestured broadly at all of us, having people who understand what it's like to be Dad's kid without having to explain all the complicated parts, that would be valuable. Tasha reached across the table and squeezed Simone's hand. I'm in. For family, I mean. It won't be perfect and we'll probably drive each other crazy sometimes, but it feels worth trying. One by one, they committed. Derek and Vanessa first, their bond as full siblings giving them confidence in the possibility of extended connection. Kyle with his characteristic straightforwardness, saying he'd already lost 30 years and wasn't interested in wasting more time on ambivalence. Tyler last, hesitant but ultimately agreeing with a shrug that tried to hide deeper emotion. Then all eyes turned to me. I'd been silent through the declarations, feeling the weight of decision pressing down. These people wanted something from me, wanted investment and vulnerability and trust. Wanted me to choose them actively rather than being passively tied by circumstance. I don't know if I can, I admitted, the honesty feeling both liberating and terrifying. I want to. Part of me really does. But I'm so angry still. At Dad, at the situation, at having my entire life recontextualized without consent. I don't know how to build something new when I'm still grieving what I thought I had. Vanessa's expression softened with understanding. Then don't decide yet. Take time. Process. We'll be here when you're ready, and if you're never ready, we'll understand that too. But stay in touch, Derek added. Even if it's just occasional texts. Don't disappear completely. The compromise felt manageable in a way full commitment didn't. I nodded slowly. I can do that. I can stay in touch. The conversation shifted to logistics after that. They created a proper group chat, not just the one Howard had started but one we owned ourselves, naming it Bennett Bunch with affectionate irony. Vanessa set up a shared calendar for potential gatherings. Derek volunteered to host Thanksgiving if people were interested, mentioning his house had enough space for everyone plus partners and kids. I listened to the planning with mixed feelings. Part of me wanted to dive in, to embrace this ready-made family that had materialized from tragedy. But another part, the part still raw with betrayal and loss, held back instinctively. Trust had been shattered, and rebuilding it would take more than a single weekend of forced proximity, no matter how surprisingly positive that weekend had been. We spent the last few hours at the cabin cleaning up, packing belongings, erasing evidence of our occupation. It felt metaphorical somehow, this restoration of the space to its neutral state. We were leaving the cabin different than we'd arrived, but the cabin itself remained unchanged, ready for whatever came next. As we loaded cars in the early afternoon, preparing to scatter back to our separate lives, the farewells carried unexpected weight. Vanessa hugged each sibling tightly, extracting promises to text during the week. Derek did the same with less overt emotion but equal sincerity. Even Tyler, who'd been so closed off initially, accepted embraces with something approaching warmth. When Vanessa approached me, I stiffened instinctively before forcing myself to relax into her arms. She smelled like the vanilla lotion I'd noticed in the bathroom we'd shared, an ordinary detail that somehow made her more real, more human, less threatening. Take your time, she whispered near my ear. We're not going anywhere. I nodded against her shoulder, not trusting my voice. When we separated, I saw understanding in her expression, the recognition of someone who'd also been hurt by our father's choices and was choosing grace over grudges. The drive back to Portland felt longer than the drive out had been, as if I were traveling not just through space but through fundamental shifts in identity. I was no longer an only child. That singular status that had defined me for 29 years had been permanently revoked. In its place was something more complicated and uncertain, a web of connections I hadn't chosen but couldn't entirely reject. My apartment welcomed me back with familiar quiet, but the solitude that had always felt peaceful now carried an edge of loneliness. I unpacked mechanically, started laundry, checked work emails that had accumulated during my weekend absence. Normal tasks that should have grounded me instead highlighted how much had changed. Grace called within an hour of my return, her timing suggesting she'd been waiting for me to get home. Tell me everything, she demanded without preamble. Are they horrible? Are you okay? Do you need me to come over with wine and terrible movies? Her concern loosened something in my chest. They're not horrible, I admitted. They're actually kind of great, which makes it more confusing. I recounted the weekend in detail while Grace listened with minimal interruption, her occasional questions helping me organize my own thoughts about the experience. By the time I finished, I'd been talking for nearly an hour. So you like them, Grace summarized. But you're afraid to like them because that feels like betraying your anger at your dad. Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. How do I do both? How do I hold space for being furious at what he did while also building relationships with the people his choices gave me? Maybe you don't have to reconcile it, Grace suggested. Maybe you just accept that both things are true. You can be angry at your dad and grateful for your siblings. Emotions don't have to be logical. The permission to hold contradictions helped. I'd been trying to force my feelings into neat categories, to decide if this was ultimately good or bad, blessing or curse. But reality was messier than binary choices allowed. Over the following weeks, I maintained minimal contact with my siblings as promised. The group chat stayed active with casual updates and occasional photos. Vanessa shared pictures of her kids' Halloween costumes. Derek posted about a carpentry project gone hilariously wrong. Tasha asked for restaurant recommendations when she had to plan a birthday dinner. Normal sibling interactions, I supposed, though I had no real baseline for comparison. I contributed sporadically, dropping a message when something reminded me of a conversation we'd had at the cabin or responding to direct questions. But I didn't initiate much, still maintaining careful distance. My work provided welcome distraction. I threw myself into current projects with intensity that probably worried my clients but resulted in excellent designs. The couple whose kitchen I was renovating expressed delight with my innovative use of their awkward corner space. A new client hired me for a whole house renovation after seeing photos of my previous work. But creative success couldn't entirely mask the hollow feeling that had taken up residence in my chest. I'd lost my father, yes, but I'd also lost my understanding of my own history. Every childhood memory now required re-examination. Had he been present at my school play because he loved me or because it was my turn in his rotation? Had our Sunday brunches been genuine connection or obligation he was dutifully fulfilling? The journal entries I'd found at the cabin offered some answers but created new questions. He'd written extensively about guilt and love, documenting his struggle to be enough for everyone while knowing he was failing. In one entry from 15 years ago, he'd written specifically about me. Laura's piano recital today. She played Chopin beautifully, her fingers moving across the keys with confidence I envy. Afterward she hugged me and said I was the best dad in the world. The words cut deeper than she could know. I'm not the best dad. I'm barely adequate, dividing myself into fractions that add up to less than a whole person. But I can't tell her that. Can't explain that while I was watching her perform, part of my mind was calculating whether I could make it to Derek's baseball game afterward or if the traffic would make me too late. She deserves better. They all deserve better. But I don't know how to give it without destroying everything I've built. Reading his words, I'd felt the genuine love alongside the profound dysfunction. He had cared. He'd simply been too weak or too scared to care in healthy ways. That understanding didn't erase the hurt but added nuance to it. 3 weeks after the cabin weekend, Vanessa texted me directly rather than in the group chat. Can we meet for coffee? Just the two of us? I have something I want to talk to you about. My first instinct was to decline, to maintain the safe distance I'd been preserving. But Grace's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that growth required discomfort. I agreed to meet at a cafe in Selwood, neutral territory between our respective homes. Vanessa arrived exactly on time, sliding into the booth across from me with 2 drinks already in hand. Got you a latte, she said. Vanilla, right? I remember you mentioned that at the cabin. The small observation, the attention to detail, caught me off guard. Thanks, I managed, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. Vanessa didn't waste time on small talk. I wanted to apologize, she said directly. For existing, I guess. For being part of the complication that hurt you. I started to protest but she held up a hand. Let me finish. I know intellectually that none of this is my fault or yours or any of ours. Dad made the choices that created this situation. But I also know that finding out about me and the others destroyed something for you. Your sense of being special, of being the chosen one. She smiled sadly. I had that too, you know. Thought I was the daughter he loved most because he came back for me even after divorcing Mom. Turns out we were all living in the same delusion. The honesty was startling and disarming. I don't know what to say, I admitted. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that I see you. I see how hard this is. She paused, stirring her coffee unnecessarily. I also wanted to tell you something I found. She pulled a folded envelope from her purse and slid it across the table. It was addressed to me in my father's handwriting, my name written in his distinctive block letters. Where did you get this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It was in Dad's workshop at his house. I went there last week with Derek to start sorting through his tools and business papers. We found a drawer full of sealed letters, one for each of us. Vanessa's expression was gentle. Howard doesn't know about them. They're not part of the official estate. Just final words Dad wanted us to have. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope. It was thick, multiple pages inside. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately. Another part wanted to burn it unopened, to deny my father the last word he hadn't earned the right to speak. I can't read this now, I said, tucking it into my bag. But thank you for bringing it. Vanessa nodded understanding. Mine destroyed me, she warned. Also healed something, but the destroying came first. Just be ready for that. We talked for another hour, the conversation eventually moving beyond our father to our actual lives. Vanessa told me about her marriage, her husband Marcus, who sounded patient and kind. She shared stories about her kids, the challenges of parenting 3 children under 10. Asked about my design work with genuine interest, requesting photos of recent projects. In turn, I found myself sharing more than I'd intended. About the pressure I'd felt to be perfect, to justify my father's obvious preference for me even though I hadn't known other children existed to be preferred over. About my own relationship history, a series of partnerships that had failed because I'd unconsciously sought men who would center their lives around me the way my father had. That's the other damage, isn't it? Vanessa observed. We all learned dysfunctional love from him. Derek's been divorced twice. Kyle struggles with commitment. I held on to a bad marriage way too long because I was terrified of abandonment. She met my eyes across the table. Dad's choices didn't just affect our relationship with him. They shaped how we approach every relationship. The insight resonated uncomfortably. My previous boyfriends had all eventually complained that I was too demanding, requiring constant attention and reassurance. I dismissed them as not being committed enough, but maybe the issue had been my expectations, warped by a father who had indeed made me his priority even when that priority was stolen from others. After leaving the cafe, I drove home with Vanessa's words and the unopened letter both weighing on my mind. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days, its presence both magnetic and repellent. I'd pick it up, turn it over in my hands, then set it back down unopened. Finally, on a Friday evening after finishing a particularly challenging work week, I poured a glass of wine and forced myself to break the seal. My darling Laura, the letter began in my father's handwriting, slightly shakier than I remembered but unmistakably his. If you're reading this, I'm gone and you've learned about your siblings. I've imagined how that discovery might happen dozens of different ways, but in none of my imaginings were you prepared. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it. You were born from love, real and genuine. Your mother was light and creativity and everything I hadn't known I was missing. When she told me she was pregnant, I should have made clean choices. Should have ended my marriage to Diane properly or stepped away from Patricia entirely. Instead I tried to have both, and in doing so, I began the pattern that would define and destroy the rest of my life. By the time you were old enough to understand, I was already maintaining 3 families. Derek and Vanessa from my marriage to Diane. You from my relationship with Patricia. And Kyle, whose mother Jennifer I'd met during the chaos of my divorce. Each relationship had seemed manageable in isolation. Together they required constant deception that ate away at my integrity like acid. I could tell you I tried to stop, but that would be a lie. I did stop trying. Somewhere around your 10th birthday, I accepted that I lacked whatever strength was needed to untangle the mess I'd created. So I managed it instead. Scheduled visits, tracked conversations to avoid contradictions, maintained separate relationships with each of your mothers based on what they were willing to tolerate. You got the best of me, Laura. I know that's not fair, but it's true. Sunday brunches were sacred time I protected fiercely. Your recitals and school events took priority over others. When you called needing advice or just to talk, I made time immediately. The favoritism was obvious and wrong, but I couldn't help it. You were my chance to do fatherhood right, even though the foundation I'd built it on was completely wrong. The other children suffered from my preferential treatment of you. Derek learned early not to count on me for important events. Vanessa stopped asking me to meet her friends because I canceled too often. Kyle barely knew me for most of his childhood. The younger ones, Tasha and Brandon and Simone and Tyler, they got fragments of a father, pieces so small they couldn't construct a whole person from them. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that my love for you was real, even if the life I built around that love was false. Every moment we shared together, every conversation and meal and embrace, those were genuine. I was fully present with you in ways I couldn't manage with the others, and while that's not something to be proud of, it's the truth. I hope you'll know your siblings. Not for me, though I'd be grateful if you did it partially in my memory. But for yourself. They're remarkable people, Laura. Derek has integrity I never possessed. Vanessa has grace I couldn't access. Kyle has the courage to face hard truths that I spent my life avoiding. The younger ones have strengths I barely got to know but recognize as far exceeding my own. You would have been a wonderful big sister if I'd given you the chance. You still can be, if you choose. Not to replace what you've lost but to create something new from the wreckage I left behind. I love you. I always have. I always will, wherever I am now. But I love the others too, and they need to hear that as much as you do. So I'm saying it here, in letters I hope Howard or Vanessa or Derek will find and distribute. My love was never the problem. My cowardice was. Be brave where I was weak. Be honest where I was deceptive. Be whole where I was fragmented. You have it in you, all the strength I lacked. I saw it in you as a child and it's only grown stronger. I'm sorry I never said this to your face. I'm sorry for so many things. But mostly I'm sorry I wasted time I could have spent building the family you all deserved by instead protecting the lie I thought would keep everyone safe. All it did was rob us of decades we could have spent together. With all my love and all my regrets, Dad, the letter blurred as tears streamed down my face, hot and fast and unstoppable. He'd known. He'd understood exactly what he was doing and how it would hurt us, and he'd done it anyway, year after year, choosing comfort over courage. But he'd also loved me. Really, truly loved me, not as performance or obligation but as genuine feeling. That truth sat alongside the betrayal, refusing to be dismissed or simplified. I called Vanessa without thinking, needing someone who understood the peculiar grief of mourning a deeply flawed father. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. I read the letter, I said, my voice thick with tears. I know, she said gently. Want me to come over? Yes, I admitted. Please. She arrived 30 minutes later with ice cream and tissues and the understanding that sometimes grief needed company more than solutions. We sat on my couch eating directly from the containers, and I showed her the letter. Mine said similar things, Vanessa said after reading. About how he loved us but failed us, how he wanted us to build what he couldn't. She set down her spoon with careful precision. Do you believe him? That he really loved you? I considered the question seriously. Yes, I finally said. But I also think love wasn't enough. He needed to be better than he was, and love alone couldn't make that happen. Vanessa nodded slowly. Derek's letter told him he was proud of how Derek had become a better father than he ever was. Kyle's apparently apologized for the decades of lying Kyle's mom did and admitted he should have fought harder to be in his life. Each letter was customized, specific to that child's experience. So even in death he's managing us separately, I observed. Giving each of us what we need to hear rather than one universal truth. Or maybe there isn't one universal truth, Vanessa suggested. Maybe his relationship with each of us was legitimately different, and he's acknowledging that. The conversation wandered through philosophy and memory, anger and forgiveness, until late into the night. When Vanessa finally left, hugging me tightly at the door and making me promise to text if I needed anything, I felt lighter somehow. Not healed, but less alone in the complexity. Over the next month, I found myself reaching out more in the group chat. Not forcing connection but allowing it when it arose naturally. Brandon shared a meme that perfectly captured our absurd situation and I responded with laughing emojis. Simone asked for design advice for her apartment and I offered a virtual consultation. Derek invited everyone to Thanksgiving and I said yes before I could overthink it. The holiday arrived with typical Pacific Northwest rain, steady and cold. Derek's house in Tacoma was warm and chaotic when I arrived, filled with the sounds of children playing and adults cooking. His wife Jennifer greeted me with a warmth that suggested Vanessa had prepared her for my complicated feelings. Meeting nieces and nephews was surreal. They called Derek and Vanessa's kids cousins naturally, having already integrated the extended family in ways we adults were still navigating. A 6-year-old named Emma, Derek's oldest, attached herself to me immediately, showing me her room and her art projects and her collection of rocks from various beaches. "You're my Aunt Laura," she informed me seriously. "Daddy said you're his sister, but you just found out." "That's weird, but okay." Her acceptance, uncomplicated by adult baggage, cracked something open in my chest. "Yeah, it is weird," I agreed. "But okay is a good word for it." Dinner was loud and crowded and nothing like the quiet Thanksgivings I'd spent with just my mother or just my father in recent years. We had to squeeze extra chairs around the table, and serving dishes required careful coordination to pass. But there was laughter too, genuine and frequent, and moments where I forgot to feel awkward. During dessert, Kyle stood and cleared his throat for attention. "I want to say something," he announced, his military bearing evident even in casual clothes. "We're all here because Dad screwed up massively." That's just true. But we're also here because we chose to be. We could have taken our inheritance and walked away. We didn't. He looked around the table, meeting each sibling's eyes. "I've been in combat zones where the guys on your left and right make the difference between living and dying. You don't choose those guys based on whether you like them. You trust them because you're in it together." He smiled slightly. "We're not in a war zone, obviously. But we're in something together. And I'm grateful for that." Derek raised his glass. "To choosing to be here." The toast echoed around the table, glasses clinking, and I found myself joining in with surprising sincerity. I was here. I'd chosen to be here. That was significant. After dinner, as some people cleaned up and others entertained children, Vanessa found me on the back porch where I'd stepped out for air. The rain had stopped, leaving everything washed clean and glistening. "You doing okay?" she asked, leaning against the railing beside me. "Yeah," I said, surprised to realize it was true. "I think I actually am." Vanessa smiled. "Good. Because I was thinking, and you can totally say no, but maybe we could do a sister's lunch? Just you, me, Tasha, and Simone?" The suggestion felt both appealing and terrifying. A smaller group meant less ability to hide, more pressure to actually engage. But it also meant the possibility of deeper connection. "Okay," I agreed. "Let's try it." The first sisters' lunch happened 2 weeks later at a Thai restaurant in downtown Portland. The 4 of us sat in a corner booth, initial awkwardness fading as we discovered shared experiences that transcended our different upbringings. We'd all inherited our father's hands, long-fingered and capable. We all gesticulated when excited about something. We all had his particular way of tilting our heads when listening intently. But we were also distinctly ourselves. Tasha's warmth and easy empathy. Simone's sharp wit and observational humor. Vanessa's maternal pragmatism. My own tendency toward control and perfectionism that I was slowly learning to recognize and moderate. By the time lunch ended 3 hours later, we'd made plans for another meeting. And another after that. The sisters' lunches became monthly traditions, spaces where we could be vulnerable about our father's legacy without pretense or performance. The brotherhood formed their own connection, group texts about sports and occasional fishing trips that I was peripherally aware of through the main family chat. We were building something complex and multi-layered, not trying to manufacture one single family dynamic but allowing multiple smaller relationships to develop organically. My therapy sessions during this period focused heavily on integration. How do you incorporate new truths about your history without discarding your lived experience? My therapist had asked. It's not about choosing one narrative over another. It's about expanding your story to include complexity. That expansion was painful and slow, requiring me to sit with contradictions rather than resolving them. My father had loved me and betrayed me. My childhood had been real and based on lies. My siblings were strangers and family. All of it was true simultaneously. 6 months after the cabin weekend, I was sitting in my apartment working on designs when my phone rang with Derek's number. When I answered, his voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. "Laura," he said. "I'm at Dad's house. The city is moving forward with the sale and I'm doing final walkthrough. Can you come?" "Why? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly. But there's something here you should see. Something in the workshop." I arrived 20 minutes later to find Derek standing in the familiar space where I'd spent so many childhood hours. He pointed to a corner I'd somehow missed during my previous visit, where a large object sat covered by a tarp. Together we pulled the covering away, revealing a wooden hope chest, beautifully crafted with intricate inlays depicting 8 different scenes. I stepped closer, recognizing each scene as representing one of us. A piano for me. A baseball diamond for Derek. A wedding arch for Vanessa. A marine emblem for Kyle. A schoolhouse for Tasha. A fish for Brandon. Dancing shoes for Simone. A book for Tyler. There was a note attached in our father's handwriting. "For my children. May you fill this together with memories I failed to give you the chance to create." We'd found his final gift, a physical representation of the family he'd hoped we might become despite his failures. Derek and I stood staring at it, this beautiful piece of craftsmanship that had required hours of detailed work, and I felt something in me finally break open completely. "He wanted this," I said, my voice catching. "He really wanted us to be family." Derek nodded, his own eyes wet. He just didn't know how to make it happen while he was alive. We called the others, and within 2 hours everyone had arrived. We stood around the hope chest in the workshop that smelled of sawdust and old wood, 8 siblings brought together by death and connected by choice. The inheritance money had long since been distributed, the legal obligations fulfilled. We were here because we wanted to be, because in the wreckage of our father's deception we'd found something worth building. It wasn't perfect. We still had difficult conversations and moments of friction. Tyler sometimes withdrew when things got too emotional. Brandon's humor occasionally crossed into inappropriate. My own need for control clashed with Derek's stubborn independence. We were all damaged in our own ways, carrying scars from childhoods marked by absence and lies. But we were also healing, slowly learning what healthy family looked like by creating it ourselves. The hope chest became a traveling tradition, rotating between our homes, gradually filling with photos and mementos from gatherings and celebrations. Evidence that we were building the family our father had fractured before we could know it existed. Standing in that workshop surrounded by my siblings, I realized I'd stopped thinking of them that way. They weren't my siblings, categorical and distant. They were Derek and Vanessa and Kyle and Tasha and Brandon and Simone and Tyler. They were people I was choosing daily to let matter, to let in, to trust despite every instinct that screamed trust was dangerous. My father's greatest failure had inadvertently become his greatest gift, and I was finally ready to accept it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, nearly a year after my father's death. I was meeting with clients about their kitchen backsplash when my phone buzzed insistently. Grace's name flashed across the screen 3 times in rapid succession, which was unusual enough that I excused myself to check. "Turn on the news," her text read. "Channel 12. Your father's name is being mentioned." My stomach dropped as I pulled up the live stream on my phone. A reporter stood outside a building I didn't recognize, her expression grave as she spoke into the microphone. Behind her, police tape cordoned off what appeared to be a construction site. Authorities are investigating allegations of financial fraud involving Bennett Carpentry, a local contracting business owned by the late Richard Bennett. Former business partner Thomas Crawford filed charges this morning claiming Bennett diverted nearly $200,000 from joint projects over a 5-year period. Crawford alleges the money was used to support multiple undisclosed families. The words hit me like physical blows. I stood frozen in the hallway outside the client meeting, my phone screen blurring as my eyes refused to focus. This couldn't be happening. We'd settled the estate. Everything had been carefully divided and distributed. The business had been sold to Thomas Crawford himself, who'd seemed genuinely grief-stricken at the funeral. My phone erupted with notifications. The family group chat was exploding with messages, everyone having apparently seen the same news report. Derek's message cut through the chaos with typical directness. Emergency family meeting. My house. Tonight at 7. Everyone needs to be there. I returned to my clients on autopilot, apologizing for the interruption and somehow managing to finish the meeting despite my racing thoughts. As soon as they left, I called Howard Walsh, our father's lawyer, but his secretary informed me he was already aware of the situation and was reviewing documents. The drive to Tacoma that evening felt endless despite the relatively short distance. My mind spun through possibilities, trying to make sense of new revelations that threatened to rewrite everything we'd carefully constructed over the past year. We'd done the hard work of forgiving our father's personal failures, of accepting his flawed love alongside his deception. Now we were learning the deception might have extended beyond relationships into criminal activity. Derek's house was already full when I arrived. Everyone had come, even Tyler, who'd driven down from Seattle despite having an exam the next morning. The atmosphere was thick with tension and confusion. Vanessa paced near the fireplace while Kyle sat rigidly on the couch, his military bearing even more pronounced under stress. The younger siblings clustered together, their usual easy banter replaced by anxious silence. "Okay," Derek said once we were all assembled. "Let's figure out what we actually know versus what's speculation." Kyle pulled out a laptop and turned it to face the group. "I did some research this afternoon. Thomas Crawford filed a civil suit claiming Dad systematically overbilled clients on shared projects and pocketed the difference. He's got bank records showing deposits into Dad's personal accounts that don't match the business ledgers." "How much are we talking about?" Brandon asked, his usual humor completely absent. "The suit claims $200,000 over 5 years, Kyle continued. "But that's just what Crawford can prove. He's implying there might be more." Tasha's voice was small when she spoke. "Does this mean we have to give back our inheritance? If the money was stolen?" "Howard's working on that question," Derek said. "But it's possible, yes. If the estate was funded through fraud, we might be liable." The implications settled over us like ash. Not only had our father lied about his personal life, he'd potentially stolen to maintain those lies. Every dollar we'd inherited, every piece of the estate we divided, might have been built on theft from honest clients and a business partner who'd trusted him. "I think I'm going to be sick," Simone whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. Vanessa stopped pacing and turned to face us all. "We need to consider that this might not be true. Crawford could be lying, trying to get money from the estate now that Dad can't defend himself." "Why would he do that?" Tyler asked. "He bought the business. He got what he wanted." "Maybe the business wasn't as profitable as he thought," Kyle suggested. "Maybe he's looking for someone to blame for bad finances." The possibility offered a slim thread of hope to cling to. But deep down, I suspected we all knew the truth. Our father had been capable of sustained, elaborate deception in his personal life. Why would his professional life be any different? Howard Walsh arrived an hour later, his expression grim as Derek led him into the already crowded living room. The lawyer's usual composed demeanor had cracked, revealing exhaustion and what looked like disappointment beneath. "Thank you all for coming," he began without preamble. "I've spent the afternoon reviewing your father's financial records in detail, cross-referencing them with the evidence Crawford provided." He paused, seeming to steel himself. "I'm afraid the allegations appear to be legitimate." No one spoke. The confirmation of our worst fears hung in the air, too heavy to process immediately. Howard continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Your father maintained several separate bank accounts I wasn't aware of during the estate settlement. Money flowed into these accounts from Bennett Carpentry's business account in amounts that don't correspond to his stated salary or profit sharing. Crawford has documentation showing projects where clients were billed for materials and labor that don't match actual costs." "So he was stealing," Derek said flatly. "From his own business partner? From clients who trusted him?" Howard nodded reluctantly. "It appears so, Yes. I believe he was using the additional funds to support his various households. The amounts roughly correlate with the financial support each of your mothers received. The room erupted then, voices overlapping as everyone tried to process this new dimension of betrayal. Vanessa was crying quietly, her hands pressed to her face. Brandon had gone pale, staring at nothing. Tasha kept shaking her head as if she could physically reject the information. Tyler had his arms wrapped around himself, looking younger than his 23 years. What happens now? I heard myself ask, my voice sounding distant and mechanical. Crawford is willing to settle, Howard said. He doesn't want a prolonged legal battle that would damage the reputation of the business he now owns. He's asking for $150,000 to be paid from the estate funds that were distributed to you. But we already spent some of that money, Simone protested. I paid off my student loans. I put a down payment on a car. I understand, Howard said sympathetically. Crawford is willing to accept payment plans. He's not trying to bankrupt anyone. He just wants restitution for what he believes he's owed. Believes? Vanessa latched onto the word. So there's still doubt? Howard's expression was carefully neutral. The evidence is compelling. But in legal terms, nothing is certain until proven in court. If you want to fight this, you have that option. However, I should tell you that fighting would be expensive, would likely drag on for years, and based on what I've seen, you'd probably lose. The weight of the decision pressed down on all of us. We could fight, could try to protect the inheritance we'd already integrated into our lives and futures. But doing so would mean defending our father's actions, arguing that he hadn't stolen from people who'd trusted him. It would mean becoming complicit in the very deception we'd been trying to process and move beyond. Derek looked around at each of us, his jaw tight. I vote we settle. Pay back what Dad stole, clean up his mess even though we didn't make it. Agreement came slowly but steadily from around the room. Kyle nodded first, his military ethics clearly guiding his choice. Vanessa wiped her tears and raised her hand in consent. The younger siblings followed, some more reluctantly than others, until only I remained uncommitted. All eyes turned to me. I thought about the money sitting in my savings account, the security it had provided, the future possibilities it represented. I thought about using it to pay for sins I hadn't committed, to make right wrongs I'd had no part in creating. But I also thought about the hope chest in my apartment, about Sunday sisters' lunches and chaotic family gatherings. About the relationships we'd built from the ruins of our father's failures. Protecting our inheritance would mean sacrificing our integrity, and we'd already lost too much to his choices to lose that too. I'm in, I said quietly. We pay it back. Howard looked relieved. I'll contact Crawford's attorney tomorrow and work out the payment terms. Given that the money has to come from 8 people, I'll negotiate the most favorable arrangement possible. After Howard left, we sat in Derek's living room in shell-shocked silence. The past year of healing suddenly felt fragile, threatened by these new revelations. We'd accepted that our father had been weak in his personal life. Learning he'd been dishonest in his professional life too cut deeper somehow, suggesting a pattern of moral compromise that infected everything he touched. This changes things, Tyler said finally, his voice hollow. I thought the lying was just about relationships, about being too scared to make hard choices. But stealing? That's different. That's actively harming people for personal gain. Brandon's hands were shaking as he set down his beer. My mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. She struggled constantly with money. And all that time, Dad was sending her stolen funds to ease his guilt. We were living off someone else's labor without knowing it. The shame was suffocating. Each of us had benefited from our father's theft in different ways. The modest homes our mothers had been able to afford. The school supplies and clothes and occasional treats that had seemed like evidence of his love. The inheritance we'd already spent or invested. All of it potentially traced back to money taken from people who'd done nothing wrong except trust Richard Bennett. Vanessa stood abruptly. I need to call Marcus. Tell him we're going to have to pay back a huge chunk of our savings. We were supposed to use that money to redo the kitchen. She laughed bitterly. Seems fitting somehow. Dad's theft prevents me from renovating my house. We should tell our mothers, Tasha said. They deserve to know the financial support they received was stolen. The thought of that conversation made my chest tight. Calling my mother to explain that her ex-husband had been a thief, that the child support and occasional gifts had come from fraud, felt like twisting a knife in a wound we'd barely started to heal. But Tasha was right. The deception had rippled outward, affecting not just us but everyone connected to our father. The mothers deserved truth even if that truth was painful. I'll tell mine, Derek said heavily. Mom already knows he was flawed. This is just another dimension of it. Others made similar commitments, each of us taking responsibility for informing the women who'd been tangled in our father's web. I drove home that night with a leaden feeling in my stomach, dreading the phone call I needed to make. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice warm with pleasure at hearing from me. Laura, sweetie. What a nice surprise. Mom, I said, my voice already unsteady. I need to tell you something about Dad. About where his money came from. The conversation was every bit as difficult as I'd anticipated. My mother's initial shock gave way to dismay and then a weary acceptance that suggested she'd been expecting something like this for years. She asked detailed questions about the amounts, the timeline, whether I was going to be okay financially after paying back my share. I should have known, she said finally, her voice small. The money was always too convenient, arriving exactly when I needed it most. I thought he was just good at managing finances. I never questioned where it actually came from. It's not your fault, Mom. You didn't know. But I could have known if I'd asked the right questions. She sighed deeply. I chose not to look too closely because I needed the help and I didn't want to risk it disappearing. That makes me complicit in some way. Her guilt mirrored my own, the recognition that we'd all been beneficiaries of fraud even if we'd been ignorant of it. Innocence and complicity weren't mutually exclusive. We'd lived off stolen money, enjoyed lives made easier by someone else's loss, regardless of our awareness. Over the following days, news of the scandal spread through Portland's tight-knit business community. My own clients began asking uncomfortable questions, wanting assurance that my design work wasn't similarly fraudulent. I had to explain repeatedly that I'd had no involvement in my father's carpentry business, that his crimes weren't mine, even as I prepared to pay back money that proved otherwise. The family group chat, usually full of casual updates and plans, went dark. No one knew what to say to each other. The comfortable intimacy we'd built felt suddenly uncertain, as if our father's latest betrayal had poisoned the relationships we'd formed in response to his earlier ones. A week after the meeting at Derek's house, Vanessa texted me privately. Can we talk? Just you and me? We met at the same Thai restaurant where we'd had our first sister's lunch, the familiar setting feeling bitterly ironic now. Vanessa looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd been sleeping as poorly as I had. I keep thinking about walking away, she admitted once we'd ordered. From all of it. The family connections, the effort of maintaining relationships with people I barely know, all of it. It would be so much easier to just take my portion of the debt, pay it off quietly, and go back to my life as it was before Dad died. I'd had the same thought, lying awake at 3 a.m. staring at my ceiling. The bonds we'd formed were still new, still fragile. It wouldn't take much to sever them completely, to retreat back into comfortable solitude where I didn't have to carry the weight of anyone else's feelings or failures. Why don't you? I asked, genuinely curious. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment. Because my kids love having aunts and uncles. Because I actually like you all, even when things are hard. Because she met my eyes, her own glistening with unshed tears. Because walking away would mean Dad won. Would mean his failures destroyed not just what we had with him but what we built in spite of him. Her words resonated with something I'd been trying to articulate to myself. Our father's pattern had been avoidance, running from hard truths and difficult choices. Walking away from our sibling relationships because they'd become complicated would be repeating his mistakes, choosing comfort over commitment. But staying is so hard, I said quietly. Every time I think I've processed everything, there's another revelation. Another layer of lies to unpack. I'm exhausted, Vanessa. Me too, she agreed. But maybe that's what real family is? Not the easy, uncomplicated version we see in movies, but the messy, difficult version that requires constant choice and effort. The idea was both daunting and oddly comforting. We weren't failing at family by finding it hard. We were just experiencing the reality of it, stripped of illusions. Our food arrived and we ate slowly, conversation drifting to safer topics. Vanessa's daughter had lost her first tooth. My latest client wanted a Victorian aesthetic in a modern space that was proving challenging to execute. Normal life continuing alongside crisis, the way it always did. Before we parted, Vanessa hugged me tightly. Don't disappear, okay? Even if you need space, don't disappear completely. We need you. Her words stayed with me as I drove home. Being needed felt heavy but also anchoring, a tether to something beyond my own comfort and preferences. The family group chat slowly came back to life over the following weeks. Brandon posted a meme about debt that earned reluctant laughs. Tasha shared photos from her classroom, third graders holding up artwork. Kyle asked for help moving furniture, and Derek and I both showed up, the physical labor providing welcome distraction from mental turmoil. Howard Walsh negotiated a settlement that spread payments over 2 years, making it manageable if not easy. Each of us owed roughly $19,000, a significant sum but not crushing. I adjusted my budget, cut back on discretionary spending, picked up additional consulting work. The money I sent each month felt like penance, buying absolution for sins I hadn't committed but had benefited from. Thomas Crawford accepted our payment plan with what Howard described as relief mixed with sadness. He'd lost a business partner he'd considered a friend, learned that friendship had been built on deception and theft. Our restitution couldn't repair that betrayal, could only acknowledge it financially. 3 months into the payment plan, Derek organized what he called a family work day at his house. Mandatory attendance, he'd texted. We're going to talk about everything we've been avoiding. I almost didn't go. The thought of another emotional excavation made me want to hide in my apartment indefinitely. But Vanessa's words echoed in my mind. Don't disappear. So I showed up, along with everyone else, to Derek's backyard where he'd set up a fire pit and arranged chairs in a circle. We're going to do this properly, Derek announced once we were all settled. Everyone gets to say what they need to say about Dad, about this whole situation, without interruption. Then we decide together how we move forward. Kyle went first, his military training evident in how he'd prepared his thoughts. I've been thinking about integrity, he began. About how Dad's lack of it infected everything. I joined the Marines because I wanted to serve something bigger than myself, wanted to be part of something with clear values. Learning Dad was a thief makes me question if I was running from his example or unconsciously following it in some twisted way. His honesty opened the floodgates. Brandon talked about feeling tainted by association, worrying that people would judge him for his father's crimes. Simone admitted she'd been having nightmares about police showing up to arrest her for fraud she hadn't committed. Tasha described the shame of explaining to her school principal why her name was appearing in news articles about financial scandal. Tyler, usually so quiet, spoke with surprising intensity. I barely knew Dad. 6 months of occasional contact before he died. And in that short time, I built this image of him as someone trying to make amends, trying to finally be honest. Now I find out even during those 6 months, he was still lying, still stealing. There's nothing real to hold on to. Just lies all the way down. Vanessa cried as she talked about her children asking questions she didn't know how to answer. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that their grandfather was a criminal? That the stories she'd told them about his kindness and skill were true but incomplete? When it was my turn, I found words spilling out that I hadn't consciously formed. I'm angry that we have to do this. That we have to be the ones to clean up his mess, to rebuild what he destroyed, to figure out how to be family when he never showed us how. I'm angry that every good memory is now contaminated by wondering what he was lying about that day, who he was stealing from. I'm angry that I can't even confront him because he's dead and I'm stuck with all this rage and nowhere to put it. The validation of speaking those feelings aloud, of having them witnessed by people who understood, loosened something that had been clenched tight in my chest for months. Derek went last, his voice rougher than usual. I'm the oldest. I knew him longest. And I keep asking myself if there were signs I missed, warnings I should have caught. Could I have stopped this if I'd paid more attention? The guilt was evident in every word, the burden of the eldest sibling who felt responsible for younger ones he hadn't known existed until it was too late to protect them. After everyone had spoken, we sat in silence broken only by the crackling fire. The air felt clearer somehow, as if our admissions had burned away some of the toxic secrecy. So here's what I think, Kyle said finally. We can't change what Dad did. We can't make it not have happened. But we can choose how we respond. We can be the people he wasn't. Honest even when it's hard. Present even when it's easier to disappear. Committed to each other even when the connection is painful. Brandon nodded slowly. No more secrets. That's the rule going forward. We don't have to share everything, but we don't lie. Not to each other. The agreement rippled around the circle, each of us committing to a standard our father had never managed to meet. It felt both impossibly ambitious and absolutely necessary. As the evening wound down and people started heading to their cars, I found myself standing with Vanessa and Derek by the dying fire. The three of us, the ones who'd known our father longest in different configurations, looked at each other with weary understanding. Are we going to be okay? I asked, the vulnerability of the question surprising me. Derek considered before answering. I think so. Not today, maybe not for a long time. But eventually, yeah. We're going to be okay. Vanessa slipped her hand into mine, her grip warm and solid. We're already okay, she said. We're just becoming a different kind of okay than we planned. Driving home that night, I felt the weight of the past year settling into something I could carry. Our father's theft was one more betrayal in a long line of them, one more truth to integrate into the complicated portrait of who he'd been. It didn't erase the earlier work we'd done or invalidate the connections we'd formed. It just added another layer, another challenge to navigate together. The payments continued monthly, a tangible reminder of cost and consequence. But alongside the payments, so did the family gatherings, the group texts, the sisters' lunches and brothers' outings. We were learning to hold both realities simultaneously, the damage and the healing, the betrayal and the bond. My father had given us a mess. But in cleaning it up together, we were creating something he'd never managed to build, a family founded on truth instead of lies, on choice instead of obligation, on the daily decision to show up even when it was hard. That was worth more than any inheritance, worth more than the comfort we'd sacrificed. It was the only thing worth having at all. 2 years after my father's death, I stood in Derek's backyard watching my nieces and nephews hunt for Easter eggs while my siblings argued good-naturedly about whose potato salad recipe was superior. The final payment to Thomas Crawford had cleared my account 3 weeks earlier, officially closing that chapter of our shared history. The relief had been profound but also anticlimactic, as if I'd expected some dramatic transformation that never materialized. Tyler had graduated college and was starting graduate school in Seattle, talking about marine biology with the passion our father had once shown for woodworking. Brandon had gotten engaged to a woman who knew everything about our complicated family and loved him anyway. Simone had been promoted to principal dancer in her company. Tasha's classroom had won an award for innovative teaching methods. Kyle had started his own security consulting firm. Vanessa's youngest had just lost another tooth, the tooth fairy's going rate apparently a subject of intense negotiation. Derek's carpentry business was thriving, his reputation untainted by association with our father's crimes. And me? I'd learned to introduce people as my siblings without the qualifier of half or the explanation of how we'd met. The story was ours to tell or not tell as we chose, but the reality had become simply fact rather than crisis. Grace joined me near the fence, handing me a beer with a knowing smile. You look peaceful, she observed. I considered the word, testing it against what I felt. Yeah, I guess I am. It had been a long road to peace. Therapy had helped, as had time and the consistent choice to show up for these people even when showing up was hard. We'd had arguments, of course. Disagreements about holiday scheduling and hurt feelings over forgotten birthdays and tension when old patterns of favoritism or resentment surfaced. But we'd worked through them, committed to communication even when silence would have been easier. The hope chest sat in Simone's apartment now, fuller than when we discovered it. Photos from gatherings, ticket stubs from a trip we'd taken to the coast together, handwritten notes from game nights and celebrations. We were creating the memories our father had hoped for, building the family he'd envisioned but never managed to facilitate. My mother had remarried quietly 6 months ago, a kind man named Robert who'd known about our family's complications from the start and accepted them with grace. She seemed lighter now, as if confessing her old suspicions about my father had released weight she'd been carrying for decades. We had lunch monthly, our relationship stronger for its honesty. I'd even visited Diane, Derek and Vanessa's mother, at her invitation. We'd sat in her garden drinking iced tea while she told me stories about my father as a young man, before the lies had compounded into disaster. She'd shown me photos I'd never seen, a version of him I'd never known. It hadn't erased anything, but it had added dimension, reminded me that people contained multitudes even when those multitudes were contradictory. Thomas Crawford had sent a note when the final payment cleared, brief but genuine in its acknowledgement. Your father was my friend before he was my thief. I'm glad his children are better than he was. The words had hit harder than I'd expected, recognition from someone outside our family that we'd chosen a different path. Emma, Derek's daughter, ran up to me clutching a purple plastic egg. Aunt Laura, look. I got the golden ticket. Derek had apparently hidden a special prize, and her excitement was infectious enough to pull me fully into the present moment. What did you win? I asked, crouching down to her level. She opened the egg to reveal a piece of paper. Family movie night at my house. I get to pick the movie and everyone has to come. The prize was perfect, so perfectly Derek in its emphasis on togetherness over material reward. Everyone groaned theatrically when Emma announced her win, but the complaints were performance. We'd all show up, would crowd into Derek's living room with popcorn and commentary, would create another memory for the hope chest. As the sun started setting and people began packing up leftovers, Vanessa pulled me aside. I've been thinking, she said, about doing something to mark the anniversary. 2 years since we all met at the funeral. A memorial? I asked, uncertain how I felt about that. She shook her head. Not for him. For us. A celebration of what we built from what he left behind. The distinction mattered. We weren't honoring our father or pretending his choices had been acceptable. We were acknowledging our own work, our own choice to transform inheritance into something worth keeping. I'm in, I said, and meant it completely. Kyle overheard and joined us. Whatever we do, we should plant something. A tree maybe, at the cabin. Something that grows. The metaphor was obvious but effective. We'd taken root in unexpected soil, had grown despite conditions that should have stunted us. A living memorial to resilience seemed fitting. Plans formed quickly as others added ideas. We'd return to the cabin in Bend, the place where we'd first attempted family. We'd plant 8 trees, 1 for each of us, creating a grove that would outlast our lifetimes. We'd fill the hope chest with new memories and seal it properly this time, deciding it would live permanently at the cabin as a record of what we'd built. Driving home that evening, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, standing shell-shocked in that funeral chapel while strangers claimed my father as their own. She'd been so certain that biology couldn't create family, that shared DNA was meaningless without shared history. She'd been wrong, but understandably so. She hadn't known yet what could be built from honest effort and consistent presence. My phone buzzed with a message to the family group chat. Brandon had posted a photo from the egg hunt, all 8 of us crowded into frame, laughing at something Tyler had said. We looked related, not just in features but in comfort, in the ease of people who'd chosen each other daily until the choice became second nature. I saved the photo, adding it to the collection I kept on my phone. Evidence of transformation, of healing, of family constructed rather than assumed. My father had thought he could maintain 8 separate relationships, keeping us all isolated from each other to protect his lies. Instead, his death had forced a collision that created something he'd never imagined possible. We weren't his family anymore. We were our own, built on different foundations with different values. He'd given us each other accidentally, through deception and death, but what we'd made of that gift was entirely ours. The inheritance I'd thought I wanted, the money and the singular claim to my father's love, had proven hollow compared to what I'd actually received. 7 siblings who knew my worst moments and chose me anyway. A family that felt earned rather than given. Peace that came from truth instead of comfortable lies. I thought I was an only child. I'd been wrong about that, wrong about so much. But sometimes being wrong about everything leads you to exactly where you need to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.